Our illustrious leader, Allison, is watching the clock for me, so I wanted to kick this off. We have a lot of great learning to start, and I can't believe it's already here. Seems like just a few months ago that we were in this very room kicking off the 24th annual Law Conference. So we're excited to welcome you. My name's Kim Novak. I'm honored to serve on the advisory board for the Law Conference. I'm pleased to see familiar faces and new faces in the room. We want to welcome you to the 25th Annual Legal Issues in Higher Ed Conference here at the University of Vermont in the beautiful Davis Center. You will note that the Davis Center is not just high-tech and aesthetically appealing, it's also a green building, and one of the things that we've done to support that is to give you water bottles. So we ask that you use those and fill those at the water station as needed. If you set yours down and don't remember which one is yours, just let us know. We'll grab you an extra. We have 60 dynamic participants who you will not get to personally meet during the conference because they are with us virtually. They are tucked away at their home institutions safely. Maybe some of them warm, maybe others not so warm, but they're learning with us, and we want to welcome them. And we want to let you know that your moderators and your facilitators will all be pulling the voices of our virtual learners into the room with us. Thanks to the support of the HESA grads, the higher ed grads here from the University of Vermont, who've for years been a critical as part of the operation of this particular conference. So they'll be catching questions from our folks who are with us virtually. This conference is possible through a lot of dynamic partnerships. Tonight we'll have a reception that will be hosted by one of those partnerships, Paperclip Communications, probably best known for their robust offerings and webinar and virtual education opportunities. I'm excited personally that the University of Vermont Law Conference and Paperclip have joined together as partners because so many of us work with both entities. We're also excited that the National Center for Campus Public Safety, which is coordinated through the leadership of Gary Margolis and Stephen Healy, Kim Richards, and a multiple of other people who are with us at the conference are a sponsor. And the ACPA, the ASCA, and other professional higher ed organizations are also here. And they're set up out by the fireplace. So pop by their tables. They have resources to offer. You can learn about membership in those organizations. I know for years, Chuck Carletta has always said that one of the most critical things that we can do to continue this dialogue is to engage in it at other conferences, one of his favorite being the Association of Student Conduct Administrators. Our speakers who are here are top of the line, as you will see, but they wouldn't be supported or able to attend without the great support of the staff from the University of Vermont. So I want to in particular thank Allison for all the hard work that she and her team have put into today. A number of individuals are here as board members. If you have an interest in serving on the advisory board for the law conference, we are in recruitment mode. We're not in rush mode. We are in recruitment mode for my fraternity and sorority friends in the room. Look for either someone at the registration table or we're lucky enough to wear the red ribbons so you can stop and say, hey, how do I get involved in helping to advise on the curriculum, content, and facilitators for the conference? And we'll be more than happy to make that connection for you. Networking is a really important part of this conference. That's probably one of the greatest gifts that I've taken after being here for a little over 12 years, is not just what I learn in the meeting rooms, but the opportunities to engage outside of meeting rooms. And we provide a multitude of opportunities for that. At the end of each day, we will have an Ask the Expert opportunity. And so that will be your opportunity to either think about things throughout the day that maybe the facilitators or the faculty haven't had a chance to respond to. Although, sidebar, you can always catch them in the hallway and ask questions if you need. That's just how this conference rolls. Don't be afraid to walk up to someone who's just done a presentation and ask them follow-up questions. That's part of the experience. This is a very intimate collegial conference, and so we love to engage both in the meeting space and outside of the meeting space. But those end-of-the-day meetings are really targeting for us to allow you to bring to the table issues, questions, concerns that you have on topical issues. And our meals are set up very much to allow for that. You'll note that in your registration package you have coupons or some formal documentation that will allow you to eat here in the Davis Center at one of the wonderful places. I highly recommend the sushi. It's actually really good. I know sushi in Vermont, but trust me, it's actually very good. For those of you back home, grab a sandwich and a Coke, and we'll roll on without you. But we encourage you to either eat downstairs and engage with the college students, those whom we are here to learn about actually at the end of the day, or if you'd like to continue a more personal conversation, come back upstairs, and we'll have space set up for you so that you can join in with each other. Check your registration bag. It has the answer to almost any question you can have. I'm excited that all the conference materials this year will not be on the thumb drive, although I'm not going to lie, I've used that thumb drive a lot over the course of the last year. Now I don't know what I'm going to do for my super secret thumb drive that keeps all my deepest, darkest secrets on it. Let's hope I don't lose it and it doesn't fall into the hands of the wrong person. But we're on Dropbox now. You know what that means? All the faculty who didn't get their materials in on time, you will eventually get them in the Dropbox and they will be current. And so if you are not a Dropbox user, I will give you a quick heads up. It takes a lot of space. So once you have access, you might want to move them over to a personal file or buy a little extra Dropbox space. Trying to think, other really important things. Enjoy yourselves. Ask lots of questions. Let us know what we can do to make you feel comfortable. Welcome to the beautiful state of Vermont. I want to get to the program, so I'm going to introduce my dear friend and colleague, someone who's mentored me into the field. Probably one of the things he told me he's most proud of is that he is one of the few left in the room of the men and women who dreamed of this experience. Chuck Carletta from RPI helped put this conference together in its very early stages, and we brought him from the Stetson Law Conference to help make that happen. So we owe a great debt of gratitude to him for keeping this conversation going. I will welcome him to the podium and let him introduce our next speaker, Chuck Carletta.
This is our 25th year. I just want you to think about this. This idea was started at the Stetson University School of Law by Professor Robert Bickel and was promulgated through the years until a young woman from the University of Vermont, with Professor Bickel's permission, hijacked it and brought it here to do it in October. She figured back then that if the sun in Florida could attract people in February, then the leaves in Vermont could attract people in October. And our California visitors clearly welcome that. Carrying on the tradition, we are privileged to have with us someone who fits into the mold that we all carry just as perfectly as if he came up through the ranks of this conference, and that is the current president of the University of Vermont. He is an educator, he is an administrator, he is a teacher, and he is a lawyer. God help us all, right? Tom Sullivan became the 26th president of the University of Vermont and State Agriculture College in July 2012. We first met in 2012 at this conference. Prior to becoming president, Tom served as senior vice president for academic affairs and provost at the University of Minnesota from July 2004 through January 2012. He has also served as the dean of the University of Minnesota Law School. He is a nationally recognized authority on antitrust law and complex litigation, having authored 11 books and over 50 articles. He has visited as faculty or served as faculty at Georgetown University Law Center in Washington. He twice was a visiting scholar at Cambridge University in England. He served as a visiting professor at the University of California, Berkeley, the University of Chicago, and at New York University. He served for 6 years as Dean of the University of Arizona College of Law and as Associate Dean at Washington University in St. Louis. He began his career in higher education as a faculty member at the University of Missouri, Columbia. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I present to you the President of the University of Vermont, Tom Sullivan.
Good morning. Thank you, Chuck, for that very generous introduction, and congratulations for being present at the creation 25 years ago and envisioning with other colleagues this marvelous conference that has, as Chuck said, been going on for 25 years. So congratulations to this 25th silver anniversary. We are delighted here at the University of Vermont to host all of you, some 200 plus, and 70 or 100, I'm told, streaming online today. Many of you have come many many, many miles here. And the only regret I have this morning is somebody brought us some cold weather, because just before you arrived, we had a glorious fall going on here. If you go up into the mountains, I'm told we actually had snow last night, so you can actually get some skiing in actually today. I'm going to give some remarks here, but I wanted to especially thank all of the organizers, Chuck, Peter Lake, whom I'm going to introduce in just a minute, who have put so much time and energy into what is going to be a phenomenal schedule and programs for you. I've looked that over carefully, and I am so impressed with the range of material that you're going to be covering. And I know Peter in a minute is going to give you a tour de force on 25 years of changing law over the higher education landscape. And Peter, that is a huge transformation, I can tell you, and how the law has treated and is treating and is likely to treat higher education in the coming years. The University of Vermont is delighted, as Chuck said, to have been the host now since 1990 for 25 years. And I hope it shows this university's commitment to the education of all of us to be able to be on the front lines of knowledge with regard to the legal regulatory scheme in the United States, whether federal or state, and how it applies to our individual colleges and universities, and particularly to your day jobs of each of you. For many of you, this may be your first time here in Vermont or in Burlington. Let me greet you and welcome you all. I know many faces here. You've been here before, so you know what a great place Burlington, Vermont is. Very special. With the Green Mountains and the Adirondack Mountains all around us, and that fabulous lake right next door to the campus. But I thought I just would mention, for those of you who might not know the University of Vermont that well or be first-time visitors, we are a public Ivy with a mission that is very student-centered driven at this university. 225 years old, 1791. And for those of you who are lawyers, that's the exact date, 1791, when the Bill of Rights to the United States Constitution was adopted. We were there, or at least some of us were there, way back then. Fifth oldest university in the Northeast. We have 13,000 students on campus, and about 70% of those students now and historically are out-of-state students, and about 30% Vermont students. And we believe we have a phenomenal educational opportunity for our students in the liberal education space, focusing on the great liberal arts and humanities, and as well as the sciences, with emphasis particularly on the environment and on healthcare. We take seriously at the University of Vermont our teaching and learning, our discovery, and our research mission, particularly as we focus on that student experience and the successful pathway of those students. As a university president, I can tell you in all honesty, hardly a week goes by when I don't say to myself, I don't know how I could do this job without my legal education and my legal experience. And I wonder about so many of my colleagues who haven't had that opportunity and that education and training. But the result is that we have become so over-regulated in higher education, both the federal and the state level. I don't have to tell you that because you all know that. That's a large part of your day jobs. But I thought I would, before I introduce Peter, your principal speaker this morning, I'd offer a few thoughts about legal education, legal regulation over higher education, and particularly some cases that are before the United States Supreme Court. So while Peter, I think, is going to talk largely a retrospective analysis of what's happened the last 25 years, I want to forecast where we are and where we may be going with the United States Supreme Court, with cases particularly, I think, relevant to higher education. So some of the big issues that I foresee on the horizon and are before the court this term. First, some of those changes we see at the Supreme Court. The court, up till this week, has already selected 47 cases on its docket between the first week in October and the last week in June, roughly. And by mid-June, they'll take another 20 or so cases. One of the interesting turns about the United States Supreme Court recently is, since Chief Justice Rehnquist's term as chief, the court is taking far fewer cases. In the 20th century, that averaged around 200 decisions a year, and we're now down in the last 5 or 6 years on an average of only 68 cases. That is an enormous change in the Supreme Court processes and ultimately the Supreme Court jurisprudence. So I wanted to mention 4 particular cases on this docket that I think have huge public policy and particular higher education implications. The first, of course, is affirmative action. We have Fisher versus Texas, University of Texas back up, where the question is whether the University of Texas has demonstrated adequately in the evidentiary record that there was no other way for them to be able to have a diverse student body but for the way they implemented their admission plans. You'll recall that this case originally had a turn with Bruder versus Bollinger case out of the University of Michigan Law School a number of years ago, and this was a turning point case where the United States Supreme Court said universities, public universities, have a constitutional discretion to use affirmative action in the admissions process. They don't have to, but they make a compelling case for doing so in their discretion. But the court put substantial limitations on that and said race could be one of many factors used. This case, coming up now on the court's docket, looks at the University of Texas admissions policies again, second time it's been up in a number of years, to see whether or not the actual mechanisms of the enrollment procedures at Texas comply with that broad standard. You may use it among many, but in this case, it's the focus question of, is this the only way you could diversify your university, or are there least restrictive or least onerous admissions processes that could achieve the same? The second one is in the criminal procedure context, which may not have a direct bearing other than the long pipeline of students into the admissions process, Montgomery versus Louisiana, where the court is taking up a question of retroactivity of application of a decision it made a number of years ago, and the decision a number of years ago was that you could not give a mandatory sentence to a juvenile for a murder or a homicide without parole, violating the Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment. And this case says, shall we apply that doctrine retroactively? In criminal law, the court rarely applies the decision retroactively, meaning a lot of the prisoners might be now let out of jail by reason of a decision that came earlier. And that's going to have a profound effect on the criminal justice system and how we treat juveniles. And depending upon how that decision goes, many of those juveniles may be let out of prison and hopefully one day will want to be going to our colleges and universities. The biggest case, I think, affecting higher education before the court, very controversial area, public employee unions. Before the court this term is whether when you have a public union and members pay either dues if they're fully supportive of the union or fees if they're not supportive of the union. The law up until this time has been you can require an employee in a public union to pay fees if not dues because of the alleged benefit that one gets with regard to their advocacy on behalf of the faculty or the staff. This case is going to determine whether or not forcing anybody to pay a dues or a fees to the union violates the First Amendment speech clause. And 4 justices have already signaled that they're ready to reverse this long-standing pro-union rule. And so this is a case to really watch, those of you who have unions at your colleges or universities. The question is whether or not the compelling of the payment of that fee is compelled speech against one's will, political will and speech. And of course, this case is made more prominent and more contemporary because of what the court did recently in the much polemic case of Citizens United, where in regard to the regulation of campaign finances, the United States Supreme Court said for the very first time, money is speech. If somebody wants to make a contribution, that is signaling their speech rights. Money is speech. Well, you can put that in the context of this union case, and if an employee is forced to pay a union fee or due, money is speech. That implicates their First Amendment free speech rights. Very, very important and controversial case before the court. The fourth one I want to mention is in voting. And this affects all of you, and certainly your students, for sure. You'll remember when civics class or any other law-related course you may have had in your life, Baker versus Carr, one person, one vote, dramatic change in the constitutional law now a good number of years ago. Well, the court this term is going to decide the actual interpretation of what does that mean, one person, one vote. So, for example, the question is, well, who gets counted in that one person, one vote? Is it everybody who lives in a particular legislative district, which has been pretty much the law up until this time? That would be children, that would be citizens, that would be non-citizens, whether documented or undocumented. Or should that be based only on those who are going to vote, the electorate, those who are registered to vote? You see the major political implications of that. It'll affect dramatically if the court says, no, the one person only applies to those who actually vote, not everybody else who's living in that district. The effect on diluting present votes in large cities, or people of color, for example, or children, or non-citizens of the United States. So a major case, again, from the United States Supreme Court. At bottom, it's a question of who will be represented by whom, and the whom will decide who's in the district and who really counts in that regard. In closing this morning, I also wanted to share with you some trend lines, and I'm sure Peter will pick up on this, but my viewpoint is from the United States Supreme Court, some real trend lines on where we see major shifts or trends out of the United States Supreme Court in the last several years. Well, one for sure is this is a court that is very much almost absolutist in First Amendment speech. We've had some fairly egregious examples where the court said that's protected by your speech rights, including demonstrations at funerals, rather odious. This is a court that keeps pushing the absoluteness of First Amendment rights. And of course, the paradigm example most recently, as I mentioned a moment ago, is Citizens United, the election, the contribution case, where the court said anybody, particularly corporations who are paying money for advertising or for contributions to candidates, that speech that can't be regulated, or it has to be a compelling case to regulate it. The second area is the other part of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, is the Establishment Clause, separation of church and state, That's kind of gone by the wayside. We rarely see a case succeeding on those grounds anymore. And the court has elevated its twin in that clause, the free exercise clause, the free exercise by individuals and how he or she want to profess or experience their religion or their faith. Very strong trend here by this court towards promoting the free exercise clause and relegating to the past the establishment clause. The third area where, of course, we've seen enormous publicity on, and that is the Second Amendment right to own a gun. The court in the Heller decision in 2008 took 221 years of established bedrock law and flipped it and reinterpreted the Second Amendment and says now people have the right to have a gun to secure their home. Now, that's the technical narrow language, but of course lower courts have been applying that more broadly. Prior to that, for 221 years, the United States Supreme Court said that Second Amendment clause only applied to support guns and ammunition for the militia. The clause starts, in the support of the militia, comma, the right to bear arms. So that's another case that's coming up again. We'll see more of those. That's a big trend that we've seen in the last several years. Finally, I would conclude with another historical shift, and this is in the privacy or the individual autonomy rights area. This is the entire same-sex cases coming up, major changes there. Finally, of course, the Affordability Care Act, Obamacare, where the Supreme Court twice now has affirmed the legality of that opinion. So those are some major changes and trends we're seeing. The court is a much more conservative court. It's also a more pro-business oriented court. And in many cases now, it's a 5-4 decision, as you know, with one or two of the justices being real swing votes and you never can quite tell. And each of those cases that I mentioned a moment ago, the 4 that I highlighted on the court's docket today, I will predict will be 5-4 decisions. They will be that close given the makeup of our present Supreme Court. Well, in closing this morning, I hope you all have a very productive and engaging session here. As I've looked at your schedule, you have an amazing tour through all of the issues of higher education because the law implicates all of them in one way or another. And it's a pleasure again this year to have Professor Peter Lake with us. Peter is a professor of law and holds the Dana Chair and as director of the Center for Excellence in Higher Education in Law and Policy at Stetson University Law School. In this year, 2015, he serves as the interim director of Title IX compliance at his university, Stetson University. He also teaches rights and comments, as you'll see here, in the areas of tort, higher education law, policy, insurance, and jurisprudence. An award-winning teacher, scholarship highly regarded, internationally renowned expert in higher education policy and law, and frequently is quoted in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Chicago Tribune, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Time, Newsweek, and Peter, I could go on and on. But I think your colleagues here know what an outstanding commentator and scholar and teacher you are on the law of higher education, and you will frequently hear him on NPR, ABC, CNN, helping us all better understand the law, particularly as it applies to higher education and the broad sweep that higher education covers. Please join me in another warm welcome for Professor Peter Lake as he's back on our campus. Peter, have a great session. Thank you.
Now it is. Ooh, watch out. That woke everybody up. Well, good morning, Vermont. I'm freezing. I just came from Florida, and I'm still like unstiffening from this morning. So, bear with me as I de-thaw here. It is a signature honor to open this year's 25th conference. This is amazing. I started the same year in higher education that this conference began back in 1990, and it has been a long and fascinating and wonderful road with some tremendous folks, including your own Kim Novak and, of course, the inimitable Charles Carletta. Tom, I have to thank you for the lovely introduction and the framing out of what we're going to do today as well. But I just have to tell you that I really am sort of overwhelmed with emotion about this, because this has been my life since I've entered higher education. I've watched this grow up, and it's a little hard to believe that 25 years have come along. So if I fight back a tear or two, you'll bear with me. I also have to thank my lovely wife, Jennifer, who's made all of this so possible for me. We travel together throughout the United States doing all the work that we do, and I simply couldn't do it without you. So thank you. You've been a big part of this journey for me. But this isn't about me. This is about looking at higher education law forward and backward, and I thought we might spend a little time framing out, where we sit in history, since this is a moment to pause and reflect on our place in time, and then talk about some of the major catalysts that have occurred in the last 25 years, the moments of change, at least through my lens, and I'm sure you have your own list, but this would be mine. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about some of the ghosts that are still haunting us from the past, and it seems like that time of year, it's sort of the spooky season. So maybe we should do a little bit of ghosts. And then we'll talk about some of these key moments, and Tom certainly hit a couple of them, and I had a couple others as well, that have really been defining for us in this last 25-year period. And as we head out the door, I thought we might look forward into the looking glass and see what the next 25 years might bring. And I sincerely hope that I'm still on the planet 25 years from now, so that I can come back for the 50th in whatever shape I'm in, and either listen or talk here to what's occurring. My dad made 99 years, 11 months and a week. He passed in May, and he told me he was surprised to have lived that long. And the doctor warned me that apparently I've won the genetic lottery, so I might be here a little bit longer than I probably should be. But in any event, there we go. Now, many of you know me, some don't, but I thought you might enjoy looking back at how I've changed over the years. So I thought it might be fun for you to see. This comes out of the archives. And by the way, if I find this on Facebook, I will hunt you down. This was me in 1990, the early 1990s. This is the ponytail era. I had just moved from New York City, being a Wall Street lawyer, and I couldn't find a decent place to get a haircut, so I just grew it long, and that's what I look like. Somewhere around Pulp Fiction, this mistake was made. And then, it seemed time to get my teeth fixed, so I went and spent a lot of money on new teeth, and I thought, I'll just cut all my hair off to really show the teeth off, so you get a chance to see this. I call this the Willy Wonka photo. And then just to prove that my wife truly loves me, I will show you what she just let me buy this year, which seems very fitting with a guy with 2 Harvard degrees and a bunch of books. Here is my new toy. And as you can see, our neighbors are already putting their houses up for sale. So over the years, I've changed a lot, different hairstyles, different weight classes, and a few mistakes were made along the way, but a lot of good friends as well. I thought to be a little more serious, it might help to frame out the eras that we've been existing in higher education law and policy. And I have to say, as we frame this out, there's one theme that came to me as we drove here from Florida over and over and over again, is if the last 25 years have been about anything in this field, it's been about the rise of the rule of law. Law has continued to assert its influence on our field, accelerating very recently, I think, through the Obama administration, but it really has been a very long-term trend to normalize American higher education under the rule of law. And I've become sort of obsessed with this idea that it's more important than ever for us to not only respect the rule of law and understand it, but to teach it specifically to the generations that come forward. That so much about what we're doing right now is incorporating the rule of law deeply into higher education training, learning, and the delivery of our core services. Unfortunately, we live in a society that often shows a great disrespect for the rule of law. We see it through violence and hate, and even in some cases with the use of law in its lowest vibration, which is just an expression of power over others, because law can be used to bully people and can be used in a dark way. And so much of my work is defense of the dark arts, is trying to teach people how to use the law in a more positive and proactive way going forward. And so today, if we leave with one message this morning, I'd like to say all of this history I'm about to frame out has been about the rise of the rule of law and how critical it is to what we're doing. Parker Young started this idea of law and policy conferences many, many years ago in Georgia. Bob Bickel picked it up and I think in many ways perfected it. We've kept the flame alive at Stetson now, closing in on 40 years. We've essentially have children, which is the Vermont Conference, which is wonderful. And the truth is we need more of this. It is such a need in this field to deliver legal knowledge, to bring the rule of law to people in an operational way so they get a chance to understand it, not just for how someone else sees it, but how they can learn to use it in their own daily operation. So again, to frame out, let's step back just quickly and have a look at these 5 eras that we've all lived in. Prior to the 1960s is the famous era of insularity, sometimes referred to as in loco parentis, and this is the pre-legal period in higher education. One that I don't think we've ever entirely forgotten, because we were Hogwarts at that time. We didn't really have to respect Muggle law. We could, in a sense, do our own thing independent of the background legal system. Very, very little law existed in higher education in proportion during this period. There's constant talk about in loco parentis returning. I want to come back to that. It's one of the ghosts that haunts us. Have we ever really left behind that pre-1960s period when we were essentially above the law? The Civil Rights era came in the 1960s, and it really fundamentally altered our field. The great scholars of the first generation in this field have spent a lot of their time and energy explicating the various issues associated with this expansion of human liberty. And it's an extraordinary time. Race, gender, disability, privacy, First Amendment rights, all the basic foundations of higher ed as we understand it today are born during this time. And I'd like to think that we're still perfecting that period. It never really truly ended. It's just gone to another stage. For example, you're going to spend a lot of time at this conference talking about Title IX. And just keep in mind that Title IX is of this era, it's of the 70s. And look how it's grown. Many people still think it's athletic equity. I can't tell you how often I have to explain that to people. It's so much more. And it really always was. What we're seeing is rights have a tendency to expand. And I think we're living in that era. It's actually a wonderful place to be. During the 80s and 90s, when I entered the field, I think we were headlong in what I've often referred to as a bystander era, where at least in terms of college safety, there was a tendency to look at college students as fully formed adults who were independent of their institutions, and it really wasn't our mission or job or even opportunity to intervene dramatically in the safety and well-being of our students. Things have changed a little bit. I think the expectations around what we will offer to our students has changed, and the law has changed as well. But the Bradshaw case, famous of this era, a case where people were injured in a car crash after an off-campus party, still hangs around in litigation. It gets still frequently cited. And so in many ways, there are some ghosts of the bystander era. We'll be back to that in a minute. The 1990s forward saw what I like to refer to as the rise of a facilitative era. New paradigms started to come into higher education and become informative of student affairs practice and practice generally. We started talking about lawyers doing preventative, not just therapeutic practice. That's from Kaplan and Lee. And we began to move into a new era of accountability, where we would have to at least answer to external authorities. And this has been a hard thing to explain to a lot of folks over the years, but even though we still tend to do quite well in court and even in front of the regulators, it isn't that we're being held liable all that often, but we are being held accountable in a vastly higher level than ever before. And you can see it being born in the 1990s, right around the time of Sugar Ray and that one haircut of mine that you saw. This started to blossom and come forward. 2008 forward saw the birth of something entirely new, Compliance University. And boy, are we in it now. And it has been quite a shock for this field to come in and become a highly regulated, federally regulated industry. It's not that there weren't regulations before, but this has been one of the most startling changes in my career, has been this period since the Great Recession, when the federal government decided to move in and become essentially the accreditor and the regulator of U.S. higher education across many metrics. People constantly ask me, is this something that's going to change? Are we going to go back to the past? And my instinct is that we're likely to see more regulation well before we see less. It seems as though we've entered a phase of regulatory intervention. What's interesting now is the states seem to want to get on the act too. So if it's good for the federal government, why shouldn't we do it at the state level? And performance funding, et cetera, is spreading everywhere. Today, it's almost impossible, as the president said earlier, to do your job without some kind of legal training. And this was not true 25 years ago. You could be an amateur in law and still do a really good job, but today, you really have to have a certain amount of basic legal training to be able to function in this field. I want to step back and talk about the rule of law for just a minute. Again, the main theme today. And I draw from an old resource when I was studying jurisprudence many years ago from Sir Henry Maine. And he said something really interesting, that the path of the law goes from status to contract. And you know, this is actually descriptive of what's happening in our business as well. When I entered the field, our institutions were still heavily driven by donative sources. Federal funds, state funds supporting and underwriting education, the largesse of wealthy institutions supporting tuition and keeping it low, and the wealth of generations that had come before. My dad's generation was a saving generation. He literally, when he passed at 99, he had used up every ounce of life in his body. He didn't die of a disease. He just did what he did his whole life. He was ultimately very efficient and saved to get the most out of every experience. And that was that generation. They saved and gave money for education, so that people like myself, when I went to school for a ridiculously subsidized price. I did not come out with staggering student loans, and most of my colleagues did not at that time, because other people were giving to us to do it. But what has shifted in recent times is the cost of education has really shifted to learners. If that has been an incredibly notable change in the last 25 years, and that shift from donors to people who want a contract is driving a lot of the changes that we see around us, and I think will continue to do so long as we shift the burden of learning and the cost of learning to learners. An interesting social experiment, one that's happened very rapidly, and I think accelerated very rapidly in the last handful of years. Where does our rule of law arise in our culture? You know, it's really fascinating when you step back and look at this. For most of us, it comes through our boards, who have a duty of obedience to the law. So in other words, to fulfill the duties that they have to institutions, there's a duty of obedience, which is interesting because our legal obligations then come almost from an external source, as if we have to be obedient to someone else. If you pick up on the theme of what I'm pushing is, I think what we need to be thinking about as we move forward is internalizing the spirit of law, as opposing to imagining it as something that's done to us or forced upon us. How can we make the law our law? And I've watched us do this over the last 25 years as we struggle with internal and external legal sources. As the law external, as the muggles have regulated us more, not necessarily understanding our wizarding culture. And surely you've read Harry Potter. If you hadn't, that's what the students are actually reading these days. It's Instagram and Harry Potter. It's not what we're teaching. As the culture projects more accountability onto us through rule of law, we also have begun to develop more internal legalistic systems for ourselves. And of course, two of the greats in our field, Pavella and Stoner, brought us codes upon which many of us rely. And this was a beginning from the inside of saying, we will do this for ourselves. We will begin to imagine the rule of law coming from within as opposed to simply something required or forced upon us. I was reflecting with Hank Newer at a recent meeting. Many of you know Hank. He's a major figure in hazing prevention nationally and a wonderful guy. And I said, Hank, how many colleges do you think actually articulate their mission statement to include compliance with the law or college safety or anything of that sort? And when you pull college missions, you will find, because they were written in another era, they tend to be fairly blind about legal matters and safety and wellness of students. There are a few exceptions that are out there, but in general, our missions were from another era. We pulled one that was sort of hilarious. It said, our mission is to promote education in our state and teach the best people so that they can help the people of our state. And I thought, with that mission, you could basically shoot all the stupid kids and comply with your mission. It'd be like the worst possible imaginable university, but you could theoretically comply on that basis. And I'm not faulting institutions for this. It's just, I think it may be time for us to go back to our core mission statements and begin to involve ourselves in an ultimate rectification exercise. Is how do we imagine ourselves in a world of law and a world where we're accountable for safety and wellness of the populations that we serve? Our missions don't always articulate that, and it actually in some ways puts us in a mission conflict with the external sources in some cases. Have you detected one thing that's fairly common today? Is there's been a bit of mistrust towards higher education. Are our motives pure? Are we doing this because it's a good thing or because we have to do it? And if you really look at it deep down, you can see that that sort of mistrust in some levels is actually built into, unintentionally, our institutional framework, because we've evolved so quickly in the last 25 years that we literally have run ahead of our own missions. And so I'd like you to step back and think how profound an opportunity this is when you're at a conference of this type. Not only to think operationally and come away with technical skills, but to return to your campus with 25 years of collective wisdom from people like Chuck Carletta, and take that wisdom and rebuild your campus to be one that shows respect for the rule of law, that teaches respect for the rule of law, and also rectifies its own internal mission to the greater goals that the institution is actually serving and being asked to serve. This is the broadest call to action, and I think it's been born of this kind of work. Catalysts. I promised some catalysts. Here's my list. I'm sure you have another one, but over the last 25 years, what has been pushing us forward and challenging us? The persistence of alcohol and drugs on our campus. This has been something I've been working on almost since the very beginning of my entry in the field, but this has had a deep impact on student safety, retention, attainment, debt, faculty issues, governance issues, etc. And so, again, it pushes us and has been a catalyst both in litigation, in and out of court. I've seen the rise of student affairs as an independent discipline. When I came in to the field, student affairs folks were often thought of as an auxiliary source. But this field has developed into its own academic enterprise, and what it's done is it's actually challenged the curriculum. Because now what I see on college campuses is the rise of meta-curricular activities, learning centers, residence learning opportunities, experiential learning, many of the learning opportunities that are articulated in the competencies that we see in the student affairs field. This is becoming a discipline right in front of us. The very curriculum itself is changing, and it's changing in tandem with the law. These curricular changes have been born out of compliance with Title II and 504, many safety laws, and the demands of our consumers. The rule of law has infiltrated our curriculum, and we're starting to make it our own. I've seen the evaporation of wealth, and also the evaporation of a commitment to learning as a public good. It seems now that what we are rapidly doing is saying, shift the cost of learning to learners. And the society increasingly does not want to support public education. States that were once bulwarks of the support of public education have retreated substantially from that, and it's been an interesting thing to watch in recent times. The rise of human capital lending. This has also been a major law and policy shift, and one that I think should be part of every conversation at a conference of this type. The new opportunity to make money in lending is clearly in human capital. And this is a global market that's growing with tremendous potential. I see great opportunity here, but it's also been driving some of the metrics and even the policy changes at the Washington level. Some of the interest groups that have been pushing agendas with the Department of Education and the Obama administration are clearly being driven by human capital lending opportunities. And so we need to think about, as we shift the cost of education to learners, how will learners pay for that education? They will likely have to borrow to do that. And so the relationship between banks, law, and students will become increasingly significant going forward. And again, I grew up in an era where, for many students, it was dreamy. We had resources, low interest loans, opportunities to pay off our debt very quickly. Things have substantially changed. I see multiculturalism, even pluralism, and certainly globalization just expanding at a rapid rate. I was just out in Kentucky for my brother-in-law's graduation at Murray State. And if you know much about Murray, Kentucky, it is not terribly close to an urban center. It's pretty much what you'd imagine. It's in the woods in Kentucky. It's a beautiful school, but it is not located in a central urban environment. And when I went to graduation, I saw the entire human population graduating. There were people from every country and culture, and I thought, wow, it has come to Murray, Kentucky. Globalization is here. And what was once a phenomenon of elite institutions that reached out globally is now ubiquitous in this field and growing very, very, very quickly. We are talking about the next culture that's about to land in our campus. Here comes Generation Z. Are you ready? Because they're not going to be exactly like the ones that came before. We live in a world of constant cultural change and globalization. More on that in a minute. Successes and challenges of disability law. I think that we are actually living in an era where we should celebrate Title II and 504. What a magnificent legal success, because we now have inherited a generation of people who've gotten access to higher education and graduate school that were almost completely blocked from that access when I went to school, even when I entered in 1990. These 25 years, we should celebrate the success of that. Now, of course, it brings challenges because we now have more students with complex issues, and it has forced us to redesign the way we deliver our services. But as you sit and grumble about the cost and the challenges of this, please keep in mind that it represents a heroic success. My personal concern is about a group I call the academic homeless, students who can't find a home at an institution and stay and persist with that. They bounce from one school to another and have trouble with reentry and readmission. I think you will see them becoming more of a focus going forward, is trying to reach out to the group that has tried but has not succeeded as easily to matriculate and attain in our institutions. Generations. We have become captive of generations and become much more aware of them. We certainly are in the era of the self-esteem generation. I assume you notice it, but I notice it in law school. I call on students in the Socratic method and have to apologize to them later for making them feel uncomfortable, which is pretty different. I'm sure Tom could tell a story about this too. Pretty different from when I went to law school, where I really didn't expect an apology from a law professor. Just didn't get a lot of those. I see a lot of parents today proxying. They want to return to higher education. So they're coming back through their children, and they're actually our customers as much as the students themselves are, which again has changed the dynamic of how higher education is delivered. I've also seen an extended infancy and even a kind of new Puritanism, which is a little surprising to me. We've extended the era of childhood now. It's intriguing to me. At 25, this conference isn't quite ready yet to move out of its parents' house. So we're still in that infancy phase to some extent, and even a kind of new Puritanism. I'm reflecting even on Title IX, and it's kind of surprising to me that the baby boom generation that was so sexually liberated has essentially engineered a legal culture for their children where having sex outside of marriage is legally very dangerous, which is very representative of the way it was in the 1950s and 40s. It's just a different set of rules that have come into being. So it's kind of fascinating how the generations project their idea of law onto themselves and their children and the expectations that they have of us. Need I tell you that despite what courts may say or even what the Obama administration has said, the expectations of parents and consumers are probably running way ahead of the law and will continue to do so. It's beginning to look a lot like a P to 20 continuum, and we just sit in one place on a long education continuum. Why should we be so different from every experience that's come before, seems to be what's developing. I've seen the redefinition of the academic workplace. We certainly have heard lots of talk about the death of tenure, the classic professorship sort of evaporating right in front of us. But there have been many, many redefinitions of the academic workplace, not the least of which has been the rise of an administrator professorial class. So we have teachers, administrators now more than ever, and they sit intriguingly at a seam in the law, the Garcetti case, in terms of public speech. So these issues of what kind of employees are we, unionized, are we teachers, are we administrators, what's our status in our institution, these issues I think have redefined what I saw when I came in 25 years ago was a simple distinction between a handful of administrators, a lot of teachers, and the students. Today I see a hybrid class of employees. Very few professors are not also shouldering some administrative responsibility, and many administrators are teaching as well. So it's a new world, a new definition. Governance and infrastructure. Our governance structures were actually built not to change. That was the whole mission for about 1,000 years in Western education, is anything that isn't clearly true must be weeded out, and we'll take our holy time, literally, to figure out what the truth is. So Galileo seems like a good idea. We might kill you, but we'll spare you. Seems like you had a pretty good thought. That's the attitude. It's the PhD dissertation defense mentality. And so we tend to be very slow to change. And yet now we're being challenged to adapt this quickly. One of the biggest legal challenges of the day, the federal government says you must come into immediate compliance with the following mandates. And the campus says, well, we'll have a meeting and we'll put a committee together. And by spring, we'll have a draft. And then the board will vote on it. The governor will look at it. It'll come back to the board. And sometime 1.5 years from now, and I'll stop with the campus and say, do you realize that compliance law time is not our time? That we're going to have to reset our clocks to a new GMT and get a master clock that's built on the time of law, not necessarily our time. This is a huge challenge for us, and it's going to take a rethinking legally of our structures and infrastructure. Success. Did we spend wisely when we were rich? Most of us don't think of success as a challenge, but it actually is. And one of the things that we're dealing with today is we bought a lot of fancy buildings, and now we have to pay to upkeep them. And rich people don't generally like to give money to upkeep buildings. They want to build new things. But how do we live in a sustainable world in that context? What is success in the field, and how would we define it? You know, the culture behind us has actually challenged us to define success, and we have struggled with that. So externally, legal authorities are beginning to set metrics for us, like the president's rating system, to define what success should be for us. I think we'll continue to talk about it. Violence, hate, and poor conflict resolution skills. These have been major catalysts. We keep talking about these issues again and again. The violence keeps rearing its head in our field. Hate speech, bullying keeps coming back, hazing. And I see a generation of people who go from I'm your BFF for life on Instagram to I hate you and you need to die. And there's very little in between. I see a lot of young folks that really don't know how to build quality long-term relationships and don't understand the value of conflict and how it builds relationships as opposed to destroys them. We can teach that. I mentioned the projection of P to 20 expectations, so we'll spare you that one doing that again. A few more catalysts and we'll get to some ghosts. Commodification, consumerism, and this job training thing that's going on. We're getting more and more focused now nationally on an agenda that higher education is first job training. It's a little spooky when you think that a lot of our students will live to be 100 to 120 years old and probably go through several career changes in their lifetimes. This is the generation that we're teaching right now that will see humans populate Mars. Imagine that. Just think ahead down the road 30, 40, 50 years, and they'll be changing careers at that stage. Are we preparing them for a global society, even an intergalactic experience, which may be coming? I mean, it seems far-fetched, but my dad told me before he passed away that he knew people had fought in the Civil War, and that his dad, who was an engineer for Pratt & Whitney, had predicted to him that someday a man would walk on the moon, and my dad said, I think my dad's crazy. And I still remember watching Neil Armstrong walk on the moon with my dad in 1969, so thinking down the road. We see more legalists and legalisms entering our field, and advocacy culture is clearly on the rise. Get prepared for that. It's coming. We'll be talking more about it at these conferences. And I have to say as well that the role of the general counsel in insurance is also changing. Something that I've noticed in the last 10 years that is a big change is general counsels used to rule the roost. But now, very often, an insurance company will come in and say, you're going to do this, you're going to do it with this set of lawyers, you're not going to do it this way. The insurance industry is asserting itself, it has to, as the cost of legal services is accelerating. There's a ghost in the machine that we need to pay attention to, and I don't want to make dire predictions, but if this follows the path of other industries, we may have capacity challenges in this business at some point where insurance may not be available to us in the way that it once was, which will change our dynamic quite significantly. Silos. We still have silos, and we've been breaking them down since Virginia Tech, but they remain a persistent challenge for us. Digitalization and the rise of narratives. I see lawyers and legalists now involved heavily, not just in litigating, but actually in telling stories, creating a narrative around an event that creates a dynamic that can help solve or cure or facilitate some kind of an outcome. This has been a big shift, is seeing lawyers in that role. And I remember even commenting to the Chronicle when they started asking me, why are lawyers talking to the press this way? I said, this is the new generation of law and legalists in this field, is we're going to have to be part, as Louis Freeh was, creating the Freeh Report, creating narratives to help build whatever we want to build on our campus. I mentioned loss of public trust, and I think this has been a big thing in the last 25 years. I've seen a decline in public trust for our core mission. People want to know, why is it so unsafe? Why is it so expensive? What are people actually learning? Are we having the Billy Madison effect where people are actually becoming dumber going to our institutions? One book actually postulated that came out, a lot of folks read. We're fighting for a position of public respect that we once used to get axiomatically. The wizards are not necessarily trusted by the muggles anymore, and they're not allowed to exist independent of that world. Ontology and the dinosaurs. It seems like everything is up for grabs today. Tenure, the credit hour, semesters, even the fact that we deliver our services in the first shift when our learners are actually second and third shift people. Their behavior is at night. Degrees versus competencies and badges. Even the classroom and the professor, everything that I came into this field thinking were the basic building blocks of higher education are now on the table, both law and policy. This might be one of the bigger points. John Dewey. I grew up in John Dewey's world. You have an experience, you think about that experience, you learn from your experience. I have the knuckles to prove it from the nuns that taught me. They expected me to sin and be stupid. They would make me think about it, they'd hit me with a ruler, and I would learn. This is how I grew. I was given the opportunity to fail. In fact, I was expected to fail. I didn't realize that until recently, that it was sort of assumed that I was going to mess up in a big way and would have to come back for some kind of redemption and learning exercise. Today, for students, failure is not an option in many cases. And we actually now have shifted the John Dewey paradigm, where students today must actually imagine experiences that they have never had, train for those experiences, and then be able to perform under the highest level of pressure accurately when that experience presents itself for the first time. I see this kind of training not only in higher education, but it's even infused itself into military training because it's life or death now. You make mistakes and you don't come back from it. Look at the Title IX training that we need to do. For many of these students, we're training them to have an experience they have not had yet, and if they make a mistake, it will be life-altering for the people that are involved in the circumstance. This is a huge challenge, and it blows past the kind of pragmatism that I was taught in another era. I'll mention quickly the fall of DuPont Circle. It hasn't completely fallen, but I have noticed a shift away of the power center in DuPont Circle. It used to drive higher education policy. What's been interesting is interest groups and advocacy groups have now taken over a much bigger role in the higher education agenda in the United States, and DuPont Circle has had to accommodate to the reality that they are no longer the only voice guiding American higher education policy, which connects with accreditation. I'm watching accreditors struggle. What's my role? Because it almost looks like the federal government has inserted itself as the federal accreditation authority. Talk a little bit about for-profit and not-for-profit. Time is a little of essence here, so I don't think I'll beat this one to death, but I think we are struggling with the profit models of our institutions, and we're, of course, having some challenges with the for-profits, but we're also realizing that not-for-profit entities, people sometimes benefit quite handsomely out of those. And so what is the nonprofit model? I see this becoming a big legal issue for the future. We've also had shifts in the background legal culture, which is important to realize that we do not dominate the legal dialogue. We're just part of a general national legal dialogue, and there have been significant shifts. You will hear about those. The President spoke about significant shifts in the First Amendment just recently. And then there's been a shifting of the academic guard, and I'll talk a little bit about our heroes here just in a second. Some ghosts, things that haunt us from the past that I think we continue to work with. I think there's still an attitude of we're Hogwarts, we're special. Keep the muggles out. Let us do our wizarding thing. And this comes from this era of insularity. I still see a little generational hubris. I think in many ways we built the higher ed learning facilities that we would have thrived in, but are these necessarily the institutions that students today would thrive in? A consumer dissonance with what we sell and what they want is the source of legal conflict. Hazing, it just doesn't go away. If I have one massive disappointment, after 25 years, we're still fighting hazing and it still pops up, and it seems to be the thing that just will not go away. I've noticed that a lot of hazing incidents seem to trail off after age 30, and I wonder if brain science will lead us to some of the answers. Because it does seem like there's some connection between prefrontal cortex development and the frequency and severity of hazing incidents. But I just don't think we're there yet. And so I'm sad about that. I hope if I come back in 25 years, we have found the cure to hazing. A little amateurism and parochialism, even nostalgia, still influences our decision-making from time to time. You will notice this. I see it on every campus. There's a tendency sometimes to think, we have the resources to do this. We don't have to reach outside of ourselves. Right here, right now, and we can do it without science or professionals. We have Steve Healy, will be on in just a few minutes coming up, and Steve and I have been talking about this with years, but there are certain functions on campus that absolutely have to be professionalized. It cannot be done by amateurs without training, and we've seen this in a lot of the safety fields. Hats off to Vermont with the National Center for Campus Safety. Kim Richmond in the back, thank you too for all the work that you're doing, professionalizing, moving away from an amateur response. The civil rights era still hangs around, and I think there are two major legal things that still hang, and I want to make sure that we have a quick look at those. One is what I call the dyads. We still live with a legal culture of the 70s that thinks in terms of this or that, black or white, gay or straight, male or female, disabled or abled. But we're now dealing with legal issues in populations that instead tend to think about continua, multidimensionality, and choices. And so as we move into a world away from the 70s, the Ron Burgundy era, we have to be thinking that the law may actually need to catch up to us and our culture as we think about choices and continuum of human behavior. due process. We're headed for big due process battles. Here they come. And it's been waiting for a long time. It's something left behind from the 70s, and I see that being a big part of the next 25 years. The bystander era. We still see a tendency to deflect, deny, even victim blame, and be pre-scientific. When you catch this tendency, it's a tendency that comes out of another era, to blame a victim, to deny that there's a problem, to try to deflect it to somebody else, and to use pre-scientific thinking to try to address the issues. The rule of law demands something broader, and I think is going to push us away from that thinking, but it's easy to fall back into this kind of thought from another era. So the 90s came along. What's still hovering over in the 90s from us? The PG-13 movie syndrome. I think we still are a little bit infatuated with the idea that everybody makes it. Rudy eventually plays for Notre Dame. The dog makes it out in the end at the end of the film. There's a happy ending. And sometimes we commit a ton of resources to situations that really are not going in a direction that we'll be able to fix. We have to begin to recognize the limits of our own facilitation. In one way of looking at this is we do have to make space for people to fail. And failure is not always bad. So there is this obsession with everybody graduates, everybody attains, but you know, sometimes when someone doesn't graduate, it's actually a good thing. And we have to make space for that. Our culture. What do I mean by this? Well, we talked about it earlier. There still is this tendency, I think, coming out of the 90s to define our legal issues in terms of our culture, not to accept the fact that we're accountable to external legal authorities. And you can see some of the struggles, particularly in Title IX, as campuses struggle to meet a Title IX culture, make it work with their own campus culture. The backlash against deanlets. This is the era, the facilitator era is the birth of a larger administrative class, but there's been a backlash against that. And a lot of folks are very unhappy about a large class of administrators working with students. How do we combat that? How do we demonstrate the value of the work that we're doing and how necessary it is in a highly compliance culture? Page forward to Compliance U. I see the academic undead. I see a lot of folks walking around now becoming compliance bureaucrats. And what they say to me is, I'm out of here. I didn't sign up for this. I didn't come into the field of higher education to be a compliance-crat. I wanted to do something else. And I think the great challenge of Compliance U is I really am afraid that it may chase out teachers and bring in bureaucrats in their place and change our mission from one of delivering an educational service to one of being excellent compliance units. We have to be a little aware of the possibility of what that could potentially mean. All right, quick tour of the last 25 years, and I know time is of the essence. These are some of my top moments in law in the last 25 years. We don't really have time to hit all of these, and we actually have hit a few of them along the way. But a bit of nostalgia on FERPA. 25 years ago, that was the big regulatory discussion. Leroy Rooker would come in, great guy. He would try to put people at ease about FERPA. He was kind of cast against type, so people didn't always feel at ease after he left. So he had to come back the next year to your meeting and do the same thing, right, Chuck? I mean, that was pretty much the minuet. Look how things have changed under the Obama administration with a newly developed and much more powerful Department of Education. Again, you can see many of these issues and see if these are ones that you also resonate with. The higher ed reauthorization process, we mentioned hate speech. I think Citizens United was huge. The idea that a college is also a speaker was a huge change in thinking that's come in my time. I think the Oklahoma matter is one that has been a defining moment, and I have a feeling the Supreme Court's been watching that because it butts headlong with exactly what the president was talking about earlier, a court that's become absolutist about speech that is not socially acceptable. What kind of power do public institutions have to regulate that? I see these kinds of fights brewing at a monumental level in the Supreme Court. We still keep fighting over Garcetti. which would attempt to silence administrators when they take an administrative role. I don't know that the Supreme Court intended that, but I do think we're going to see more fights over public speech by public employees. Don't miss the same-sex marriage case. And I'll tell you, among the many implications of that, one that I caught right away was the resurrection of substantive due process in Supreme Court analysis. I don't know where that's going, but boy, does it sound like it could be huge. I think we may be entering a new era of constitutionalism in higher education. This case could be the front edges of a much larger set of changes to come. The President mentioned Grutter, Gratz, and Fisher. I don't think we need to redo it. And again, I mentioned Title II and 504. If there's been one tremendous success legally in the last 25 years, you just have to step back and applaud the success of American disability law and how it has not only worked legally, but brought so many people into higher education that were blocked just a quarter century ago. Looking back on legacy, I don't want to wax too reminiscent, but we all have our heroes, and I think that's one of the things that's been really cool in the last 25 years, is you talk to people in higher ed and you can immediately identify who their law and policy heroes are. And I could name some of the names. I already have done many of that for all of you. Gearing, Parker Young, Bob Bickel, Kaplan and Lee, Stoner, Pavella, Carletta. These are the folks that we turn to. And at this moment in time, we're about in the process of a transition to another generation of scholars and leaders in the field. We still have these great folks with us, but time passes and we're moving forward to a new generation. We're going to have to think about what does Gen 2 look like in law and policy. As our time starts to evaporate here, I think you're going to see a lot of focus in the future on safety issues, core mission delivery, which is our core academic product, governance, and the expansion of the civil rights period further, such as Title IX. I think we need to be preparing our students for what is actually occurring as a second human enlightenment. What's so magnificent about sitting at this 25-year cusp is realizing that with the rule of law infiltrating our business, we have a chance to export this globally and bring billions of people to education, not just tens of millions. And we sit on the edge of that. By the time the 50th anniversary of this conference comes around, the number of people on the planet with higher education will have reached levels unprecedented in human history. And you should thank yourself for that, because the rule of law makes that possible. Where there's violence and hate, discrimination, there's no chance for higher education. Look at the places on the planet where they machine gun women and college students to try to keep them from education. Our sacred fight is to bring the rule of law forward, not just in our country, but globally, to bring more people to education. I can't come back enough and just say that seeing that the critical rule of law, how critical the rule of law is in our business. And it's incumbent on all of us to develop respect for the law and to teach that to the students and people that we work with on a daily basis. It's easy to say, oh, that Department of Education, what a pain in the neck. That case, I don't agree with it. Let's use the lawyers to get what we want and bully people into things. Try not to be tempted by the dark side of law. Try to imagine what the spirit of the law is that underlies it and see how we can make that ours and part of our own educational mission. It also includes recognizing the limits of law. The law can only do so much. So you can come to a conference like this and leave fairly frustrated because the law isn't going to solve all of our problems. We can't expect it to do too much. We're all just visitors here. That's coming in the next 25 years. Major pronouncements from the Supreme Court. Student affairs becomes a recognized academic discipline. These are fearless predictions when I come back 25 years from now. The law of instructional design and delivery will accelerate rapidly. Yes, professors, it's coming to your classroom. Here they come. edX was just the front edges of this, but I think instructional design and delivery is the next level of compliance activity, for better or worse. Governance, management, and white-collar crime issues will begin to predominate. We certainly have a signature criminal trial waiting in the wings right now, but I think it signals a much broader issue about white-collar crime and management, and even our governance structures. How do we create sustainable, coherent campus safety regulation? Right now, we have a patchwork quilt of national campus safety regulation. It's not really a sustainable process. We're going to have to be looking to a coherent, sustainable campus safety future, trying to integrate all of the different pieces. Anybody having any trouble figuring out who's an RE and a CSA and how they should operate with your unicorn-like agreement with local campus police, the MOU? Yeah, if you are, I think we need a better day. Explosion of science in and out of the classroom. Learning science is the interesting thing that's lagged behind. K through 12 got a heavy dose of it. A lot of what we're doing right now is pre-scientific. We still don't know as much about how higher learners learn. We're going to be doing more of that going forward in 25 years. I see also, I think fundamentally, the rise of proactive processes. Instead of waiting for legal catastrophes to happen to us, we're actually beginning the process, and we have been over the last 25 years, of trying to stop things before they go wrong, to get out there and be proactive so we don't have to go to court and fight and become oppositional. And I thank people like Chuck Carletta who had this vision long before people were talking about it, the need for proactive practices in the field. Someday, I think we will end a cycle of martyrdom in this field where our change has to occur with things like the Texas A&M incident, Penn State, et cetera. By year 50, my great hope is that we've moved to a place where we talk about things like Penn State, Kent State, Virginia Tech, and people barely believe that such things could have happened on college campuses. That they look at us incredulously and think, did that really happen in the ancient past? That is within our near future. That is our great opportunity, and it comes through respect for law and policy. I want to thank you all for your dedication. I know I've gone a little longer than I probably should have, but I feel very deeply that what we have done in 25 years together is built a culture of respect for rule of law in higher education, and that may be one of the greatest legacies of Parker Young, Stetson, and the Vermont Conference. I hope your next 25 years are even greater. Thanks for the honor for having me here today, folks. I really appreciate it.
Answer a few questions while we've got him captive. And that's not easy to get, by the way. So if you have written questions, pass them up. If you have an oral question, we have two people with microphones.
Somebody's going to ask what the car is.
And we have to keep talking here because we have people online. If we stop talking, they don't know what's going on. All right? And then that's going to start Peter up again, and you're going to be here till lunch just listening to him.
That's right, yeah.
Question, here.
I think you can hear me.
No, they can't hear you online, though.
Can you hear me online? Okay.
As good as you are, they can't hear you online.
Thank you. More of a housekeeping issue. I know the conference materials are on Dropbox, and I'm looking for Professor Lake's slides. As fascinating as it was, I could not keep up typing with all the informative information. I see the folder on Dropbox is empty. Will you be uploading that in the future then?
I probably won't be that person because I'm a tech. If I attempt to upload something, I guarantee it won't occur, but we will make every effort to get that to
We
you.
have it. Jennifer's given it to us, so we'll
Okay.
make sure it gets
Yeah.
uploaded.
Thank you.
Yeah, I destroy technology. It's that hasn't changed in 25 years.
We have a question in the corner, into the sunlight.
Hi, Peter. Matt Kairos, Montana State University.
Matt, how are you?
Good to see you.
You too.
Would you talk a little bit more about the future of tenure?
The future of tenure. I think tenure is, you might have remembered the slide about dinosaurs and ontology, and there's no question that the idea of extended employment without a high degree of accountability in higher ed is diminishing. I mean, we just are moving to a different period. And actually what I'm even noticing is that the teachers that are staying around in the tenure class now are becoming more entrepreneurial. They're recognizing that they want to build a career that's somehow connected to their academic employment but isn't entirely captured in it. And so I see a really fundamental shift in academic employment. If I were entering this field today, I would come at it very differently as a business person than I did 25 years ago. It looks very different. But I do think that there is a need to commit to a class of people with institutional memory who make a long-term commitment to their institutions. It should also be occurring in the administrative class. So I think, interestingly enough, as tenure diminishes for the classic academic disciplines, I think you'll actually see the rise of it or something similar occurring in the administrative classes. And it's happening right in front of us right now with Title IX, because if it isn't obvious from the guidance that came out this year in April from the federal government, you really do have to make a commitment to your Title IX coordinator and protect them from retaliation. So I'm thinking longer-term contracts, income leveling are not unusual. The other feature of Title IX is purely pragmatic, is that when people get good at it, they get hired away so quickly that people want to commit to their Title IX coordinators for longer periods. The year contract is something that's becoming something of a dinosaur in that field, because people know we need to keep this person around if we're going to train them up and they learn our culture. So I see that as the cutting edge of something that's coming down the road. But a certain level of fluidity is something that's developed, and I think a lot of it's been good. It helps people move between industry and higher education and move between institutions when it's appropriate for a shift.
Yes, here's a question.
Cindy Love, ACPA. I'm really intrigued by your concept of internal accountability, the development of that. And I'd like for you to just say a little more about what is actually the biggest barrier in your mind for higher education as a whole in developing that and that shift.
Sure. Thanks, Cindy. Yeah, and sort of internal accountability, because this is what I've noticed over the last 25 years is the dominant energy of the rule of law has come externally, so that we've responded to what we think we have to do. We want to be obedient, as the law might say. The challenge is to internalize that, to find the spirit of the law and make it our own. And so I look at institutional responses to Title IX, for example, and in trainings that I do, I often start from the very first premise that a learning environment that's free from discrimination is our value. It doesn't require Title IX to tell us to do that, and it's more or less impossible to teach if we're not teaching an environment that has that value and has it expressed. And that many of the very best responses under Title IX are ones that are not legal. They're conversational, impactful decisions made on the spot with people, the choice of the terms that we use. We have a lot of power to be our own law. And I think in some ways, our struggle mimics the struggles of Hogwarts. I think we have had dark energies enter our halls, and we've looked for external sources to fix it, but ultimately the strength of Hogwarts has to come from within. We have to become our own Neville Longbottoms and find a way to defeat Voldemort from within with the courage to do it. And the thing I love about that book and that metaphor is the fact that he's a simple young man. He's not the one you think is going to be the hero of the story, and I think it mimics something that's so critical, Cindy, is that we all can do this immediately when we return to campus. When we see someone who says something that we disagree with, we don't have to punish it with a rule. Maybe we do, but we could also use other techniques, educational techniques. When we see something we don't want in our environment, we don't have to hire our lawyers to eliminate it. We can find ways to learn from it and possibly find a win-win situation for people. Being tempted to the lower octaves of the law is something that people that have entered a legal field tend to do, and we're still just babies at this. 25 years in law, we're still in diapers. So, we're still getting used to how we can use the law for our best benefit. And I would urge every campus to go home and look at your mission statement. Look at the articulations that you have, and how can you build respect for rule of law and respect for the people in your environment explicitly into the mission. So as opposed to making it an obedience standard from without, it comes from within. I'm sorry, it's hard for me not to focus on someone who's in uniform. I have relatives that served in combat operations, and I thank you for everything you do for our country. And one of the remarkable things about the military that to some extent sometimes distinguishes it from our environment is the values are built into the code of military justice. It's the rule of law in the military is absolutely integrated with the rule of values in each of the branches of the military. And I had the chance to meet the architect of the codes, Hagopian, years ago, and we talked about this. We can do the same thing. So I hope that this is an inspirational message, because you come away from these conferences and you can be very exhausted by the just overwhelming externalization of accountability. I mean, it can drive you bananas with every day something new from the Department of Ed, 50 pages deep. How do we deal with that? We manage it by bringing it within, finding our inner strength and respect for the rule of law. I see a generation of students, Cindy, that don't understand the First Amendment, so it doesn't really matter what our codes say if they don't value the idea of valuing the speech of others that they don't agree with. If we can't teach that, we're nowhere. And even with safety, and Steve and I have talked about this over the years as well, is if people in the community just look out for themselves and don't take ownership of the community that they're in, the campus police can only do so much. You know, you can show up with guns and heavy and manage a situation, but you don't create a safe environment by shooting at people. It comes by ownership of the community. And I could go through every single legal metric. I'll take you to Title II. And you could look at your students with disabilities and say, this person is a challenge and the challenge is too heavy to carry. But you could also realize that every learner is truly unique. And the beauty of Title II and 504 is when we realize that we're all individuals. We all learn a little differently. We have strengths and weaknesses that are unique to us. And when you find that magic key, wherever it is, to get into the learning opportunity for that person, you're expressing the highest level of human achievement and higher education achievement. And I don't need the law to tell me to do it. So I constantly hunt for that positive solution. Do I get discouraged? Of course I do. All of us are foot soldiers in a civil rights agenda that takes a lot of individual courage to get up in the morning and do that job and get to work and come home and not be negative about it. I stand with the president at the bridge at Selma, and I think the unique American experience that's about to be externalized is respect for the rule of law, faith in the rule of law, and the willingness of ordinary people in their ordinary jobs to be the agents of the law. That it isn't something that other people do, it's something that we do for ourselves. And I'm getting the time signal pretty hard here, so
Can we get an amen to that?
Thank you all.
Thank you. I do want to let folks know that a couple of Professor Lake's texts are over here for sale. Jennifer is here with us, and she's kind of hidden behind the podium, and but please come at some juncture if you'd like this morning and pick up a copy of the book. Thank you, Peter, again, for your inspirational thoughts. To the folks who are with us virtually, keep your questions coming in, and we'll use them during the Ask the Experts panel. Hurry off to your next session.